This looks like a really fascinating and very timely talk. Reva is an educational anthropologist. She's an assistant professor of educational leadership at Montclair State, as I said. And her research focuses on immigration and schooling, the anthropology of policy and urban education reform. Her work's been in several very well-received journals like Harvard Education Review, Teachers College Record, Anthropology and Education Quarterly. And she has a fairly new book. Is that right?
Yes.
Is it new?
Yes.
With a fantastic title and fantastic cover art by a Danish artist. And her book is called Coercive Concern, Nationalism, Liberalism, and the Schooling of Muslim Youth, and it was published by Stanford University Press. And today she'll be speaking about the more we can do to try to open them up, the better it will be for their integration, challenging the radicalization politics of integration. Thank you so much. Racializing, I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
First, I want to thank you all at the Graduate School of Education and Janice and Erica for having me here today. It's really an honor and a privilege to have a chance to share my work and to have a little conversation, hopefully, at the end. So today I'm going to talk about some findings from my book that centers on my research that focuses on the experiences of Muslim youth in a Danish secondary school. My research really focuses on how I talk about how these processes of figuring, how conceptions of the immigrant are figured or constructed within discourse and policy, and how that then is taken up in the everyday interactions between teachers and students in schools. So I'm really interested in the stories and scripts about who immigrants are and the interventions that they're understood to require in order to become acceptable subjects of the nation. I've been working with Sue Wright, who's an amazing former Birmingham School cultural studies scholar, who I happened to meet in Denmark, who was working on the anthropology of policy along with Chris Shore. And their work has really helped me to think about how policy knowledge moves into and through the spaces of schools, shaping teachers' kind of common sense everyday assumptions about the kinds of identities schools should foster and the strategies that they should employ to cultivate those identities. My work is also, it's worth mentioning, heavily influenced by your very own Dr. Thea Abel-Haj, and her work on nationalism and schooling. Really, before I started talking about this business of how what happens out here shapes what happens in here around schools, it was her work that really inspired me, and I was reading her work when I went to Denmark and did my field work. So to provide a little, to let you know how long we're going to be here and what I'm going to talk about, I'll give you a little bit of a roadmap. I'm going to take you on a short tour through, so I went to Denmark, I lived there with my family for a year, and I learned that in Denmark at that time, the immigration context was very different than the context here. At this time, it is less different. So I'm going to kind of take you on a tour through my journey to make sense of what I saw in Denmark. So I'm going to start with, give you a little bit of context, start with some school-based data and talk about the community, talk about integration policies a little bit, and then I'm going to conclude my talk by sharing with you the experiences of young people and their voices to help us think about how we might create more responsive schools for immigrant students. Okay, does that all sound? So I'm curious, how many doc students in the room? Great, so mostly doc students and faculty and, okay, great. I may do some little side comments around methods because I'm also teaching qual methods to my doc students. That's helpful just to know. So I did ethnographic field work at Engby School, which is a public focus school educating students from K through 9th grade in the community of Engby between 2007 and 2011. So Engby was a place where the immigration politics were really amplified. Because Engby, it's a community outside of Copenhagen, was considered, it was on this list of ghetto communities. And part of the reason for that was that there were these housing projects in Engby, the Engby houses, that were built in the 1970s, Denmark had a labor shortage. and they welcomed mostly male guest workers from Turkey, Pakistan, and Yugoslavia to work in the nearby shipyards. But then the population grew, which they didn't really expect, in the 1980s and 90s through policies of family reunification. And then the population increased more in the 80s and 90s when there was immigration of refugees from war-torn countries. So as I mentioned, the town of Engby and Engby School was the subject of a racialized discourse about the problems of immigrant ghettos. To my eyes, it was a very beautiful housing area with community gardens and didn't exactly look like a ghetto. But while I was there, I began to see this kind of racialized discourse. There was a newspaper headline saying, and this was meant to be a bad thing at the time, Engby is a Danish Harlem. It's no longer safe. Now we all know that Harlem is not. But I also heard this discourse taken up within the school. So within Engby School, it was considered a ghetto school because over 40% of the students are first and second generation immigrant students. And so teachers would kind of talk wistfully about the days when, prior to immigration, when Engby School was a real Danish school, and one student explained to me, when parents come and they see all the brown faces, they don't think it's a good school. So we hear echoes of some of these discourses around urban schools that we hear even in the U.S. Within the politics, there was a sense that immigrant students were a liability to the school's image, and it's worth mentioning that since I started my research, the school has closed. So this talk that I witnessed in the community really reflected a neo-nationalist discourse that gained momentum in Denmark in the 1990s. Which emphasized the ways that immigrants threaten national identity and Danish values. So in 2000, this advertisement was published in the year 2000, and this kind of echoes this broader discourse on the perceived threats to Danish value, and particularly the threat that immigrants pose to Danish values of gender equality. So the advertisement implies that Denmark, as a multi-ethnic society, is vulnerable to the constant threat of insecurity, violence, and oppression. And it creates this kind of dystopic, Dorothy Holland talks about counterworlds, this image of a dystopic counterworld to kind of appeal to and justify for political support for coercive policies that promise to restore a Danish future. This is kind of this strategy of invoking these dystopic scenes is a familiar one that we witness here today, which politicians use to garner votes for their campaign. So since the time that the Dansk Folkeparti started this campaign, it's steadily gained popularity, and it's now the second most powerful political party in Denmark, which is we see the same trends across Europe with these right-wing politicians gaining power. So these leaders are really whipping up public fear and anxiety and promising to protect Western nations from the threat of Islam through more restrictive policies. Now to bring us back to the school, let me just tell you a little bit about Engby School. I was really interested, I had no intention of doing my dissertation research at the school, but I was really interested in Denmark because they have a very progressive model of schooling. You don't see the typical equity traps that you see in U.S. schools. They have a kind of K through 9 system where students stay with a class. It's a very kind of hands-on, project-based, child-centered approach to learning. You're beginning to see the testing influencing the Danish education model, but in general, it's a very progressive model. There's no tracking. And we would really expect it to be a best case scenario for the education of immigrants. And also there aren't the kind of resource inequities. Like I walked into a Danish school and immediately there's like the cantina serving organic food and the beautiful Danish light fixtures, and there's children's paintings lining the walls, and you really expect to see very good things happening for all children in these spaces. Yet I began to hear these racialized representations of the Muslim youth, And that was kind of confusing to me. So I'm going to share with you now, I'm going to actually share with you now a classroom observation which happened approximately in my second week of observing in Engie School. And then I'm going to present some different perspectives. So I'm going to do some triangulation here to show you how events are understood by how one event is understood by different actors. So the scene is a 9th grade Danish English class where everyone's learning English, the language of instruction is English. There are 15 students, 8 ethnic Danish students and 7 immigrant students. And Lena, the teacher, asked students to silently read the story Fatima and Sarah, which describes a Turkish Muslim girl, Fatima, who's berated by her angry father for speaking to a boy on a street corner. And the story ends with Fatima's aunt suggesting that she should leave school to prepare for her impending arranged marriage. I'm already like, okay, something fishy, something funny. We have like half the class is immigrant students, and why are we reading this story of all stories? This is kind of like when you're doing ethnographic qualitative research and your hair starts to stand up on the back of your neck a little bit, and you're like, wait, what's happening? Something's happening here, but I don't quite understand what it is. So after reading the story, Lena began a class discussion, and standing at the front of the room, she asked the class, so how do we feel about Fatima and her problem? An ethnic Danish student said that the story reminded her of the movie Shakespeare in Love. Then Lena asked again, so what do we think of these problems with impossible love? And she asked two Palestinian boys, Mohammed and Jamal, who were sitting at a front table, what would happen if you brought home a girl who was Danish to your parents? And Mohammed, who had been in the school since he was in preschool, basically, and knew kind of what was going on, said it would be okay. And then she asked a Danish girl, Maj-Brit, if her parents would approve if she dated a boy who was not Danish, and she said it wouldn't be a problem. And then she turned to Dahlia, a Palestinian student who was sitting at a back table in the room with 2 other immigrant girls, Aliyah and Sarah, and she said, Dahlia, could you bring home a Danish boyfriend? Dahlia looked up at Lena seriously and said, I would not. And then she continued, but what if you fell in love with a blonde Danish boy? And Dahlia responded, I wouldn't. And then Lena repeated, but what if you did? And Dahlia insisted, I would not. And then Lena approached the question in another way. She said, but what about your own children? Would you accept it if your child came home with a Danish boy? And Dahlia replied, I would not. And she also added, and also my husband might not want it. When Lena heard this answer, she stepped back and she looked at the rest of the class and she said, and you would have to do what your husband says? At this moment, there was silence in the classroom. The teacher stepped away from Dahlia and asked the students to reflect on Dahlia's answer. So how can we help each other to understand these problems with impossible love? There was silence in the room, and Pernilla, a Danish student, said, I think it's a problem that she has to do what her husband says. It's very traditional. It's like during the time of Shakespeare, it's very traditional. So I found this moment in my fieldwork was what Michael Agar, the ethnographer, refers to as a breakdown moment, where I was really like, what the hell is going on here? And this kind of catalyzed my own ethnographic journey to figure out what was going on in this classroom. So in the hallway, after I was talking to a couple of the girls, and Aliyah, one of the other girls, tried to help me understand what was going on, she said she didn't respect Dahlia's answer. She kept asking, and then she asked the Danish students what they think, and then she said, oh, that's like an old thing, like from the Middle Ages. I think she thinks that we Muslim girls, we can't do anything. We only go to school and go home, that we're doing what our parents want us to do that, but it's not like that at all. So a few weeks later, I was interviewing Lena about Danish schools, and I didn't bring up anything about the classroom. I'd say I was very careful with the teachers because I didn't. It just was a tricky. We can talk more about that later. But and without me saying anything, I forgot this slide. This is like so. Anyway. I'll come back to that. This is the new slide. This is a new ad that came out this year, which is kind of the new discourse of, and lots of people critique this because this is a very bad Photoshop job. They had to construct this white Denmark in a very artificial. Okay. Anyway, back to the story. So I'm going to actually play you a clip of Lena, so you can hear what Lena said in this interview.
I feel suppressed, if I could put it like that, in my opinion. And also I can see in the other girl's opinion, I mean, China's sitting there and she would of course never marry a Dane, because her religion would forbid it, or her parents would not approve or whatever. I think it's interesting that we have not come any further. I mean, I think we try and we try and we try, and many others have been here for generations. I mean, that's a big part of our job, and I think that we should, of course, and I know that a lot of the teachers are actually working very, very much with it. And also that the education system is working a lot to make them have a further education. Of course, they have to be part of the jobs and the education system, and to the more we educate, the more they will be open-minded to what's going on. And I cannot just continue living in my own little safe world, where I do like my mother did, and she did what her mother did, and whatever. And I think that the more we can try to open up, the better for their integration. And still, I'm sure that we will.
Okay, I can stop. That's enough. But we get this idea that what's important is opening them up, because it's good for their integration. And we also see how this interaction in a class, this is 2 weeks later, and it's a conversation between a 14-year-old girl and a teacher, that it carried much more weight than your average interaction between a 14-year-old and a teacher. And we hear how she's talking about they've been here for generations, and where I do what my mother did and she would do. Like, there's a lot more that's carried in this interaction. It's about the problem of Muslim women in Denmark who are trapped for generations, following tradition, doing as my mother did and what her mother did. And I think that this discourse is also shaped by the fact that there's this housing project over here, and this is the way this understanding of the immigrant problem is constructed, and this is how the teacher conceives of her role to help the girls. So Lena positions herself as a caring teacher who's trying to support her immigrant students to have a better life, and Dahlia is positioned as yet another oppressed Muslim girl who resists the efforts of teachers who want to help her to be open-minded and to escape the perceived confines of her culture. Yuval Davis talks about how the figure of oppressed immigrant girls is one that invokes advocacy, anger, and sympathy, as well as collective anxieties about the integrity of the national community. She describes how, as producers of the next generation, young women's bodies become especially amplified as objects of national concern. So, okay, backtrack for a minute to the classroom. After we finished this class, I went up to Dahlia and I kind of said, "What's going on here?" And Dahlia basically said to me, "This is not the only time this happens." And here, I'll share the slide. Dahlia says, "This is not the only time this happens. In my extra Danish class, which is a class that's created by the policy where immigrant students are in a segregated space, the teacher said it's okay to date and have sex before you're married because then you get to know someone." I'm like, I don't believe her. I'm like, this is just, it's getting wackier. Like, this is just not, I'm sure she's exaggerating. I'm sure that the teacher is not actually telling a 14-year-old girl that she should have sex. And she said this never happened before when I was in Islamic school. She had just come the year before she had come from a private Islamic school. In the beginning, it was difficult for me. It's not fair, but I get used to it, I guess. So I didn't believe her, but then I interviewed Birgitta, the teacher who teaches the Danish as a second language class, and Birgitta told me that yes, in fact, she was counseling the girls that it was okay to have premarital sex as a way of supporting them to learn about Danishness. So she said they're very much struggling about being Muslim girls in the Danish schools. They can't really discuss being a virgin, if it's good, if it's fair, if you have to wait to get married. They don't really know their own opinion. They just know that it's not okay being a virgin, and it's very hard for them to get rid of their background and say what they mean. Sorry. So she echoed this stereotype that I saw across my interviews, that Muslim girls were fundamentally not individuals, that they lacked the ability to think independently, to function in classrooms where there was higher order thinking, and that they don't really know their own opinion. And she saw exposing Dahlia to Danish norms around sexuality as a path to escape the collectivities of their families, to get rid of their backgrounds, and to become self-actualized individuals. So it was interesting in my discussion with Birgitta. So she's just telling me all this. She said, I shared this article with them about hymen repair surgery. And this is when you're in an interview and it gets really weird, and I just kept nodding because I was a little uncomfortable trying to understand what she was telling me and how to make sense of this. And then I actually have the article, and it says, for Reva from Birgitta, and it's this article about hymen repair surgery. But then there was this one moment in our interview that was interesting, when she kind of became aware that I might be seeing what she's doing as coercive or racializing. And she said, but it's also hard. I mean, I shouldn't be the one to push them and say, stupid, think for yourselves. I have to show them that I respect their home views, but I have to try to show them that they live here now. And when you choose your husband, I think it's important you know who he is, to tell them that in Denmark, a way to learn about each other, to know about each other, is to have sex. So here we see this conflict between the liberal values of respecting and making space for the student's culture. It was serious taboo in that context to accuse someone of racism. There was not the kind of, even in the academy, a conversation around critical race theory or making room for difference, and so she was very uncomfortable in this moment with this idea that I might not see her as doing something that's negative for her students. And she really wants me to understand that she's helping her students to be kind of good, integrated, liberal subjects. So in my book, I theorize that immigrant students are subjected to technologies of concern that are focused on transforming them into acceptable subjects of the nation, and that processes of coercive assimilation are cloaked in the benevolent language of care and concern. This was something I saw across all my work and across the policy. So at first, this intense, what I saw in the school, which was very early in my field work, this preoccupation with girls and their sexuality was shocking to me. When I then, in the next year, when I was doing my research, started studying the integration policy, what I began to understand was that the teachers' actions were actually consistent with the agenda of local integration policies, which constructs the immigrant problem in terms of the oppression of Muslim women. So I don't think that the teachers were actually taking up, there was no directive saying counsel Muslim girls to have sex. But there was a lot in there about encouraging Muslim youth to adopt Danish values. And there was also a whole section on kind of the problem with the oppressed Muslim girl. So this section of the 2003 policy doc, Visions and Strategies for a Better Integration, constructs the figure of the Muslim woman that is captive to her traditions, who lacks equality, and who is isolated in her community from the superior values of Danish society. So I'm not going to read it, but you can see it here. Women are not considered equals. They live an isolated life in their homes and face powerful control from their families. It's crucial to break this isolation and give women the same real opportunities as men. So, but what this translated to on the ground in terms of material policies was a whole constellation of policies. So So one day, when I'm like riding my bike from the train to the Danish school, I come upon this. And one building, one side of the Engby houses was actually demolished. And I learned later that it was part of the government's de-ghettoization policy. So this policy was designed to break up high concentrations of immigrant residents and spread them through the nation. 40 apartments were demolished, and the residents were forced to move to other predominantly Danish communities to kind of try to spread them to address this ghetto problem. At the same time, there was a whole constellation of education policies that were intended to increase the time young people spend studying Danish culture and Christianity and eliminating funding for mother tongue instruction. So amongst the things that were part of the new education policy of 2005 was encouraging immigrant students to attend Danish boarding schools, requiring that parents enroll students in language stimulation classes at younger and younger ages. So it went from 4 to 3 to 2 years old, or they risked losing public benefits. So these policies claim to support equality while encouraging the erosion of culture and tradition through the opening of ghettos and through the coercive assimilation of youth that represent the next generation of students. So what I found in the school was actually that, I'm not going to go there yet. What I found in the school was that the young people were really kind of shut down because of the kind of scrutiny that they were experiencing about their identities in schools. They felt like, so for example, Aaliyah, a young woman, said to me, I can't talk about my mom. Like if I get in a fight with my mom, I can't talk about that in the classroom like a Danish girl could, because suddenly the teacher was going to be wondering what's going on in your home. So, and they also talked about how they, in the face of surveillance, just try to keep a low profile, which also then reproduced the stereotype which teachers had about the girls not being individuals and being too quiet. So you had this whole thing happening. And also, then there was a lot of there were young women who talked about being scrutinized, like when they decided to start wearing hijab, and then not feeling like they could go to those teachers who were mad at them to ask for help. So we saw that actually the teachers' efforts to help the students were not actually supporting their engagement in the life of the school and in the community. And I argue that this choice to stay quiet prevented them from accessing the important knowledge and social capital that they needed to navigate Danish society. So in the book, I argue that this kind of nationalist framing is kind of really narrowly focused on fixing girls and communities while ignoring the broader processes of structural exclusion and racism. There's no conversation within the school about how can we as a school and as a community address the academic and social needs of these kids. The focus is on our goal here is to help them become good Danes first, because they need to be good Danes in order to be effective in Danish society. And it's also influenced by not just the girls, but their fears and concerns about what's happening to our community here in Engby and what's happening to Danish society as a whole. So my work offers a general critique of the model of integration, this concept of integration, which is intended to be a model of social incorporation when minority groups are encouraged to retain their identities as part of a larger multicultural society. And this nationalist vision of integration is really calling for assimilation and the maintenance of a monocultural society. One of my mentors, Frederick Erickson, called integration a hypocritical liberal obfuscation. Right? It promotes this self-congratulatory vision of we're so open, we're here to help you, while enforcing coercive assimilation. So I'm gonna any quick questions? I know we're gonna do questions at the end, but I'm gonna kind of shift gears and now talk about the young people's experiences. Any burning? Yeah.
I'm fascinated by the fact that the focus is all on the girls, because I would think, here there's so much fear about radicalization of young men, and we have so much male violence here. in general, not that immigrants, but so it's just interesting to me, and I wonder if there's something about Danish society that makes the female so much more concerning.
So I think I should say that part of what I'm presenting here is related to the fact that of the story that I witnessed there. And I was able to really gain the confidence and become close with the girls in the school. And there is a section of my book that is on the boys. And I would say that there's more effort with the boys on kind of containing and controlling. There is a lot of work on kind of anti-radicalization work happening in Denmark that is focused on the boys. I'll present actually in what I'm about to go through. I'll show a little bit of the boy data, but it is a unique. I just did a comparative article with Thea and my friend Ana Riojas, who did work with Muslim youth in Spain, and this business about immigrants hurting our vision of gender equality is, I mean, it's a trope we hear everywhere, the oppressed Muslim woman, but it is uniquely Danish in a way that it's taken up, and that that the image of the oppressed woman is used throughout to justify policies. So I do think that that's unique, but I do think that there is a parallel concern about the boys.
Is Danish culture very gender equal? And so it's a threat to sort of their vision of Danish culture?
Yes, and there's a lot I can say about their vision of themselves as having full equality, and if you look at the major companies in Denmark and who's leading, anyway, that's a whole other, but it is part of their national story about their own goodness and their distinctive, it's we saved the Jews in World War II, and we are open, and this is part of their national story as a country. Yeah.
So in light of that, do you want to say anything about, or will you say anything about what the sort of standard sex education curriculum is? In light of what Brigitte was saying?
So it was interesting because in general, the standard standard culture around premarital sex is much more open than we have here in the U.S.
Okay. Yeah.
It's common practice, but there was such a focus on the girls that was not evident in this was not standard sex education practice for the rest of the school. When I interviewed some Danish girls, they actually told me in sex education they talked to us about making sure we care about someone, and so when I went looking and I asked those questions, I found that this is specifically targeting the Muslim girls, and this is not common practice. It's not just a matter of like they're not getting our common sex education practice. This was specifically targeting the girls. So I'm going to move on and talk a little bit about how the young people experienced these practices of coercive assimilation. So as part of this is for the doc students, I'm going to talk about a really good method that was helpful. Part of my research, inspired by Michelle Fine and Winnicott's work in social psychology, I conducted focus groups where young people created identity maps, which are visual depictions of the messages that they received about their identities in different spaces. So the prompt basically asked them to write about the various messages in their roles as students and children. And so what was interesting was, this is why focus groups are very different than interviews, because they can kind of take on a whole life of their own. And the girls immediately all sat down and they did the same thing, which was they drew a line down the middle of the page.
Here it's in Denmark.
Okay.
And that's me. And this is the Danish people. And here they are thinking that we immigrate did come to Denmark only for money, because you can not work and you can have money without work in Denmark, but not in Lebanon or in Palestine.
So that's what they think?
Yes.
Okay.
And they think also that immigrate is going to ødelægge, hvad sagde du? Destroy Denmark. Because there is some immigrant boys. Yes. And it's dark at night. I feel ensomhed alone. Yes, and nobody wants to speak to me.
And on this side?
This side, it's in Lebanon, and I feel very happy and glad. And the green color symbolizes hope. And everybody liked me, and nobody would look down at me. And all in Lebanon have the same traditions, but it's also hard because sometimes there is war, and you can't get money if you don't work. But there's love and family.
So we really hear these kind of different feelings about who she is in Denmark and in Lebanon. It's worth saying that Dahlia, this is actually Dahlia's map, the student who was questioned by the teacher. And she was born in Denmark. Yeah, in Danish, and I can't say enough about, as a method, the identity maps really help us to get you get a different emotional feeling than me sitting up here saying what the teacher did, what the students thought, and right, it really helps us to capture how these students are navigating this nationalist context and also the role of their home country. So one of the things I learned, so we hear all the kind of discursive messages in the air about immigrants, where she feels alone in Denmark in the dark of night, and she's kind of repeating this narrative that immigrants are uninvited guests, laborers who come to Denmark only for money and overstay their welcome. And so it's interesting that although she was born in Denmark and she had only visited Lebanon a couple times in her life, she describes Lebanon in these ideal ways as a place where everybody likes me and nobody will look down on me. But she also references the kind of economic challenges. It's really interesting because I had, for years, heard there's another young woman who's Palestinian from Lebanon talking about, like, Lebanon is a place where I'm free, and it's just, you know, like pictures of, like, another young woman, Sarah, sitting in a cafe, so happy, and then pictures of the community that they actually lived in a refugee camp, and their families couldn't work for generations there because they were Palestinian. So it's kind of these stark, I began to see that these connections to homeland played a very important role in providing a kind of protective source of protection in this what they felt like was a hostile context at times. So I feel like the girls really downplayed the challenges in their country, and I just said this, but the work of social psychologists Deborah Upaguia and Sunil Bhattacharya really look at how connections to homeland provide a kind of protective resource for navigating processes of racialization. I'm also working on a piece right now, and I've kind of moved on from the Danish research and I'm working here in the U.S. to look at how kind of pedagogies that engage young people's transnational experiences, that's a new piece of cultural relevance that we need to recognize, that when kids have just come here, they've spent most of their lives somewhere else. And to pretend that they're just here and we're just going to talk about here now is really wrong. So in interviews, I asked my students, I'm going to go to this. So in interviews, I asked students whether they consider themselves to be Danish and what it meant to be Danish. And over again, I've never had such saturation in my data where I was told exactly the same thing. I was told by a Turkish teacher, by students, that it was not, the Turkish teacher said, I am as Danish as I can be. She didn't say I am not Danish. Most of the students said I am not Danish. And over I was told that no, it was not possible for them to be Danish because they didn't celebrate Christmas and they didn't eat pork. But it was interesting. Then when I spoke to the boys, a number of the boys explained to me that it wouldn't be possible for them to be Danish because being Danish is ultimately kind of biologically constructed, and they also talked about how they couldn't be Danish because they're not welcome there, that they really felt excluded. So he said, he gave me the same, I don't celebrate Christmas, I don't eat pork, same thing I heard, but then he said, I don't feel like I'm welcome. When I go to parties, they're always double checking you for weapons. And I don't have this on the slide, but the next part of this conversation, he said, and if they don't accept me, I don't want to be one of them. So we hear about how this kind of process of racialization, feeling of social rejection, informed a desire not to be Danish and not to belong. So this is, again, like why these approaches are really not working to support the effective incorporate, to help these young people to feel like they belong. So I found that young people responded to concern with counter-narratives, which are kind of narrations of self in which they challenge notions of immigrants that were projected onto them. So Aliyah, a young person who identifies as Somali from Ethiopia, shook her head, and she said, she did this like this double voicing thing over and over again that I'll talk about. She shook her head and she said, in Denmark, when you watch TV and the news, every day they have something about what the immigrants are doing. They say, immigrant girls don't get to decide who they get married to. Immigrant girls have to have an operation to make sure their parents don't find out if they have sex. Immigrant girls are always in the news. If we weren't here, who would they talk about? And then later she said, the problem's not with the teachers. It's up here. It's everywhere. It's in the newspapers. It's on the street. So she was like theorizing there. She was doing my work for me there and helping me to understand what I was seeing. So another student, Sarah. Oh wait. I don't know where to hear, but that's it. Wait. Another student, Sarah, struggled with Sarah's identity map that she did when she was 14 in 9th grade. And of all of the students, she has really, in my group of focal students, she has really struggled the most. And she was really struggling in 9th grade and said, I just feel like I'm crazy and I don't know what I'm going to do. And you see the heart here. And sometimes I'm unhappy, sometimes we see, and then, the similar, in my land, I'm happy with my family. And in her second map that she did, did 3 years later, she kind of addresses nationalist discourses and policies. There's some statements, I don't know if you can see them at the top of the map, where she says, you are called the new Danish. That's one of the policies, was to try to call the young people new Danes, and they were like, we're not new Danes. Take off your hijab. And unlike her earlier map, which illustrates the ways that she's affected by these saturating discourses, in this map we see how she represents a buffered space she has created for herself, standing on green grass above a yellow sun, separated from the negative voices by a layer of blue clouds. And so we see this image of her here, growing up, and she said, I'm from Palestine and Muslim. I'm from Palestine and Muslim. I will never ever change myself. It's right I'm growing up in Denmark, but it will not change anything. Can you forget your culture? Because I can't. So we see a very different voice that she's developed years later. Here, Sarah narrates a vision of self that is Palestinian and Muslim and growing up in Denmark. And her image kind of elicits questions about the way that young people's counter-narratives provide opportunities to escape the over-determined meanings of discourse, to kind of question their taken-for-grantedness. We see her kind of turning the lens to challenge those who are policing them. And I've also been struck by, in Danish culture, Danish society, culture is so thick. It's a wonderful thing about Denmark, that there are all these wonderful traditions and ways of doing things, but this idea that young people would just let it all go to become Danish is kind of shocking given their connection to culture. So my research suggests that counter-narratives and connections to home countries help youth to buffer negative stereotypes and persist in their schooling and lives. But I think it's really, over time I've become kind of dissatisfied with this business of counter-narratives. Like, yes, they're very important, and I think that we need to create more of a space for young people to critique society within schools, but they're not really, it's important that as scholars we don't overly romanticize them, because are they really changing the material conditions in schools and young people's access to the kinds of resources that they need to be and the successful, the kind of conditions that they need to be able to learn. So, well, I think it's useful. I think that we need to also see the limitations of counter-narratives. So in a focus group in 2011, Aliyah, the student from Ethiopia who talked about them always talked about the immigrant girls, she drew an X over a picture of the Danish flag, and she explained that the current terms of the Danish discourse didn't apply to her. She said, "I'm not Danish, I'm not a new Dane, I'm not second generation. I'm Somali by nature, Muslim by choice, and Danish by paper." Ooh. She resists being forced into the rigid categories of the discourse, but whereby one is either an immigrant or a Dane, and instead she defines a vision of self that incorporates her various attachments. Her words Muslim by choice kind of challenge this figure of the oppressed Muslim woman and the idea that Muslim girls are coerced into observance of tradition. And Danish by paper highlights her legal rights as a Danish citizen, her right to belong and express her identity as a Muslim woman. I just want to go back, I think I missed one. Aliyah, and I'm going to talk more about her in a second, was amazing in that she just had this incredible wit and way of speaking back. When I asked her what it means to be Danish, she was like, "Oh, it's great. When you're 13, you drink and drink. Like every weekend, you say, oh, I went out last night and I drank so much and I got so drunk." I have a friend and she says, "I was drinking so much, like 5 beers, and I was throwing up so much. Oh my God, it was cool." So here she is, like turning the lens back from her to say, are these really the liberal values? You think that's so great? You want me to adopt all of these values? To really kind of challenge their taken for grantedness. And she did this thing, I drew on the literary theorist Bakhtin, who talks about double voicing. And she did this double voicing throughout our work together. It was very interesting. So in an interview, Aliyah said, "Just because people have looked at you wrong or said no to you because you're hijab doesn't mean you have to stop there. Without fighting, you can't get what you want." A scan of her Facebook pages reveals images of Aliyah with her family in Denmark and Ethiopia, with groups of Danish friends and Ethiopian and Palestinian friends, images of European rock bands, and a blood-stained Somali flag that reads, "Justice for Somalia and South Africa." She moves comfortably between her various selves and communities, using her multiple affiliations as a resource. And her example really kind of questions this vision, challenges this vision of integration, to show that having a strong attachment to one's home country and tradition doesn't preclude strong attachments to Denmark, that it is an either or. In young people's narrations of their identities, we hear the ways that they imagine selves that are simultaneously transcending national borders, and that they're also affected by a narrow nationalist politics. So